Hi. There are about 400 million Buddhists in the world today, mostly in Southeast Asia and East Asia, but also there are many adherents in Europe and North America. This lecture will introduce you to the Buddhist canon of Scripture. I'll explain its basic divisions and origins, and then we can take a closer look at some specific texts in the 4 lectures that follow. But right now, we'll start with an overview. The first thing that you should know is that the Buddhist canon is big. It's huge. Many Christians, despite their deep commitment to the Bible, have had a hard time reading their sacred book from cover to cover. It's about 1,000 pages of small print, so it's a serious undertaking. But the Buddhist canon can run to over 100,000 pages. It's a sacred library rather than a sacred book. I know I described the Bible before as a sacred library because it's made up of writings that were done by different authors over a long period of time, but still, you can print it in a single volume. The Buddhist canon would take many shelves to put together. The second thing to remember is that the library has 3 basic divisions. Buddhists call their canon the Tripitaka, which means the 3 baskets. The 3 baskets are the Vinaya, those are rules for monks and nuns, the Sutras, discourses of the Buddha, and the Abhidharma, which are higher teachings. They're works of systematic philosophy. I'll try not to pile on too many foreign terms, but these 3 words are important, and we'll get more details later on. Unlike in Hinduism, where there's a large body of religious literature with some rather fluid boundaries as to what counts as scripture, Buddhism has a well-defined set of sacred texts, or rather, several well-defined sets. There's a Pali canon, a Chinese canon, and a Tibetan canon. But let's start our story at the beginning. Siddhartha Gautama, the northern Indian prince who became the Buddha, lived in the 5th century BCE. After his enlightenment, or awakening, under a Bodhi tree, he wandered about for maybe 45 years, preaching the 4 noble truths and related doctrines about the nature of reality, about causation and interconnectedness, and the workings of the human mind. The 4 noble truths, as you may recall, are first, that all life is suffering. Second, that suffering comes from desire. Third, that if you stop desire, you can stop suffering. And then the 4th noble truth is that you can stop desire by following the 8-fold path, which is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Of course, Buddhists have lots of commentaries and explanations for each of those parts of their basic story of salvation. The Buddha's basic worldview was similar to that of the Hindus, right? There's 4 parts to that. There's samsara, which is reincarnation, and then karma, which is cosmic justice, dharma, which is moral behavior, and then finally moksha, which is enlightenment. It's an escape from the cycle of birth and rebirth and death. It's sometimes referred to as nirvana, and that's attained through meditation. So the metaphysics is basically the same as in Hinduism, but Buddhism has 2 important differences. The first is that Buddhists reject the authority of the Vedas and the Brahmin priests and the rituals that they perform. And the second major difference is that the Buddha taught that there's no such thing as a soul. You may remember from the lecture on Hinduism, there's Atman. But in Buddhism, there's no self, there's no soul. Instead, there are 5 aggregates. We're made up of form, like a body, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And each of those is changing at any time, and then those are together in a temporary combination that's what we might regard as our self. But that self has no eternal existence. It has no independent identity. But the Buddha never wrote any of this down. In fact, he was like Socrates or Jesus in that the scriptures are going to come from his followers rather than from his own writings. Indeed, he gathered around him disciples. who gave up ordinary life to become monks and nuns, and they listened intently and memorized the sermons that they had heard him teach. Perhaps this wasn't entirely surprising. There's a long history of oral teaching and memorization in India. Remember the Brahmins who memorized the Vedas. There's something to be said for the oral transmission of spiritual truths, that you're always learning directly from a master, from somebody who already has a good grasp of that and who can explain it. By contrast, when we read sacred texts, we're just eavesdroppers on a conversation that would have been between individuals long ago. When the Buddha died around 480 BCE, he didn't appoint a successor. Instead, he indicated that the movement should follow the Dharma and the Vinaya. Those are going to be the two, not leaders, but the two things that Buddhists can follow. And remember that the Vinaya are the teachings and rules for monastic discipline. So the word of the Buddha became paramount instead of focusing on a particular leader or person. But there were difficulties almost immediately. For example, shortly before his death, the Buddha had told Ananda, one of his chief disciples, that the minor rules for monks could be eliminated. But then Ananda forgot to ask which rules were the minor ones. So they hesitated to change anything at all. At the first 3-month retreat season after the Buddha's death, his followers held their first council. Some 500 enlightened monks gathered together for a communal recitation of the Buddha's words to make sure that everyone had gotten those oral teachings right. The Vinaya, and those are 227 rules for monks and then 311 rules for nuns, the Vinaya were first recited by Upali. He was an ex-barber before he became a monk, and because he had that skill, he was in charge of shaving the heads of the new monks. And so he heard all of those sermons of the Buddha about how monks should act and the regulations that should guide their lives. And then after Upali recited the Vinaya, Ananda recited the sutras. Ananda apparently had a prodigious memory. He was able to recite tens of thousands of words without missing a syllable. And these are words that he had heard the Buddha speak at various times and in various places. So even now, all Buddhist sutras begin, "Thus have I heard. At one time the Lord was staying at such and such a place," and then it goes on. And the "thus have I heard," the I there is going to be Ananda. It's his first-hand account. Even though some sutras present the words of the Buddha's disciples or other sages and heavenly beings. But in general, the idea is that all of these came through Ananda. The oral transmission of the Buddha's teachings continued for several centuries. During that time, there arose 18 different schools of Buddhism, each of which had a somewhat different set of memorized authoritative texts. Eventually, all of those 18 schools disappeared with the exception of the Theravada school. And the word Theravada means the teachings of the elders. Perhaps one of the reasons for the survival of this particular form of early Buddhism was the fact that Theravada monks managed to preserve the scriptures in written form. But not in India. Rather, it took place on the island of Sri Lanka off India's southeast coast. The Buddhist scriptures were first brought to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC in the heads of monks, right? They're still oral compositions. 2 centuries later, the king there, Vatagamani, fearing that too many monks would die in political turmoil and in a famine, called for a council of Theravada monks in 29 BCE. So they gathered together the monks and then 500 scribes to write down the scriptures that they recited in Pali. Pali is an old Indian language that was closely related to the dialect that the Buddha had originally taught in. The Pali canon is the oldest surviving set of Buddhist scriptures, and it's called the Tripitaka, or the Tipitaka. Tripitaka is the Sanskrit pronunciation, and Tipitaka is the Pali pronunciation. So the Tripitaka includes 6 volumes of the Vinaya, that's the first basket, right, of the rules for monks and nuns. The whole idea of baskets here is that the texts were first written down on palm leaf pages and then were piled in baskets. So the Vinaya, by this time, included not only a list of rules, but also commentaries on those rules, stories of the situations that first made a particular rule necessary, and descriptions of exceptional cases where the rules might not apply. The second basket of the Tripitaka consists of sutras in 36 volumes. The word sutra refers to a thread that holds things together. The word sutra is related to our English word for suture. So the sutras are arranged into 5 collections, or nikayas, mostly by length. There are 34 long discourses, 150 middle-length discourses, 7,762 connected discourses, which are arranged by subject, and then 9,550 enumerated discourses. And those are arranged by the number of items discussed. There are ones, and then texts that talk about 2 things, and then 3 things, and 4 things, up to 11 things within a single text. And finally, there are 15 little texts, though some of these little texts are quite long. This last section, the little text, is comprised of miscellaneous materials, many in poetic form, and it contains some of the most popular Buddhist texts, including the Dhammapada and the Jataka. And the Jataka are stories of the Buddha's previous lives, and we'll be talking about those in the next lecture. The Pali Canon was rounded out by 6 volumes of the Abhidharma in 7 texts. The Abhidharma are higher teachings. They're an analysis and commentary on various lists in the Vinaya and Sutras, with no stories or illustrations or anecdotes. They try to systematize Buddhist teachings about psychology and philosophy, about the constituent elements of reality or the mind, about causation. Perhaps a few lists were recited by Ananda at that first Buddhist council way back in 480 BCE, but this basket, the Abhidharma, was greatly developed in the centuries after Buddha's death. In this lecture series, I won't do too much with the Abhidharma, which is rather dry and specialized, but just to give you a flavor of what's going on, in one text called the Enumeration of Dharmas, there's a list of 10 mental states, all arising from good thought, which can result in right concentration. That's the 8th step in the Eightfold Path. So here's the list. When a good thought concerning the sense-desire realm has arisen, accompanied by gladness and knowledge, and has as its object a visible form, or sound, or smell, or touch, or mental state, or whatever, the object of the thought, whatever the object of the thought might be, then there's first contact, second sensation, third perception, fourth volition, fifth thought. Those you may recognize the 5 skandhas, the aggregates there. And then 6th, there's an application of the thought, and then 7, sustained thought, 8, zest, 9, ease, and 10, self-collectedness. And then each of those 10 mental states is defined in turn by a paragraph, and then the discussion moves on to other wholesome states of mind that can follow right concentration, and so forth. So it's lists of lists with explanations, terse explanations for all of those. That's the Abhidharma. And you can see there, and in other parts of the Buddhist canon, that the Pali Canon appears to have been shaped for memorization. There are lots of lists and lots of repetitions. Different monks specialized in different subsections of the canon. We'll see some specific examples of stories and teachings from the Theravada Sutras in Lecture 15. So this is the Buddhism of Southeast Asia, and the sounds of the Pali texts were eventually transcribed into various regional scripts, such as Sinhalese from Sri Lanka, into Burmese, Thai, and Khmer. There's even a transliteration of the Pali Canon into Roman letters. So it's the English alphabet, but it's the English alphabet that spells out the canon in the Pali language. And then it's accompanied by an English translation. This was a huge project that was undertaken by the Pali Text Society, started in 1881 by T.W. Rhys Davids, a British civil servant stationed in Sri Lanka. That project of the Pali Canon into English is still ongoing, because it's not just the canon itself, but also commentaries and histories and dictionaries. Okay, have you got your head around the Pali Canon? So 48 volumes, and there are 3 major divisions or baskets: Vinaya, Sutras, and Abhidharmas. Good, because things get much more complicated from here. In the 1st century BCE, there were new Buddhist sutras that began to circulate. These texts were written not in Pali, but in Sanskrit, the classical language of India, which had been used for the Hindu scriptures. And these new scriptures offered a somewhat different view of Buddhism. The Buddha was now considered as a god to be worshipped, rather than as a man who had found enlightenment and then passed from this existence into nirvana. There was more of an emphasis on bodhisattvas. And in these new scriptures, salvation was thought to be available to anyone, not just monks and nuns. These new scriptures become the basis for Mahayana Buddhism, or it's the Buddhism of the greater vehicle. These sutras were longer, they're more philosophically sophisticated, with even more miraculous elements than those of the Theravada school. And they originated as a written literature rather than as oral teachings. So you might ask, though, how can they be newer and still be more authoritative? And the answer is that these were thought to be secret teachings that the Buddha had given to some of his most advanced disciples, while the ordinary listeners got the Theravada scriptures. The disciples who were ready to hear more deeper forms of the doctrine received the Mahayana teachings, and then those were hidden away for centuries until they were recovered. But we'll talk more about this in Lecture 16. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist missionaries began to travel from India to China, and they took with them some of these new scriptures, along with the older scriptures from the Theravada and other early schools. All of these needed to be translated into Chinese, and this turned out to be a difficult task. Chinese is a very different language from Pali or Sanskrit. So these translation projects begin in about the 2nd century, and they continue for maybe 800 years. It's important that they have imperial sponsorship. They're expensive to undertake, and there are stories of heroic scholars and monks traveling back to India for authoritative texts. But Buddhist scriptures in Chinese made these texts accessible to scholars not just in China, but also in Korea and Japan and in Vietnam. In East Asia, classical Chinese was a little bit like Latin in the medieval West. It was the universal language of scholars. The Chinese canon eventually stabilized in about the 10th century, when the Chinese began to print copies of the entire canon. One of the most noteworthy printings of the Chinese canon occurred in Korea in the 13th century. That involved over 81,000 carved printing blocks with 52 million characters on them. Okay, by comparison, the Bible has about 750,000 words, and classical Chinese is a much more concise language than English. So imagine how large that canon is at 52 million words. These printing blocks have survived, still to this day, in a temple in South Korea. In the standard punctuated edition of the Chinese canon, which was published in Japan in the 1920s, there are 55 volumes of the Tripitaka, plus another 45 supplemental volumes, and each of those volumes has about 1,000 pages. The Chinese canon includes Chinese translations of 5 versions of the Vinaya from schools other than the Theravada, a version of the Abhidharma from the Sarvastivada school, and many Mahayana sutras, sometimes with multiple translations of the same one. There are also tantras, those are esoteric texts, and there are commentaries and treatises and encyclopedias and dictionaries and histories. There are even some non-Buddhist texts from Hinduism and Nestorian Christianity that made their way into this Chinese Buddhist canon. We often have Chinese translations of Indian Buddhist scriptures for which the originals have completely disappeared. All we've got is the Chinese translation. But that's not all. There's even more to the Chinese canon. From the 7th to the 13th centuries, there were translations of Buddhist scriptures into Tibetan, and eventually a separate Tibetan canon was established in the 14th century, with 2 major divisions: the Kangyur, which consists of texts attributed to the Buddha and then translated from Sanskrit originals, those are 98 volumes, and the Tengyur, which are commentaries and treatises, and that's 224 volumes. And most of these were also translated from Sanskrit. The Kangyur includes more than 600 texts, including Vinaya, sutras, and tantras, 3/4 of which are Mahayana, and 1/4 from maybe Theravada and other early schools. So perhaps 25 million words. The Tengyur is even longer, over 3,600 texts at 48 million words. And we'll come back to the Tibetan canon in Lecture 18. Obviously, the sacred texts of Buddhism play a different role in that religion than the Bible does in Judaism or Christianity. I mean, it has to play a different role just because of the size of this canon. Ordinary believers are not expected to be familiar with the entire canon, and even monks and nuns, some of whom devote their entire lives to scriptural scholarship, they can still master only a small portion of the whole. For many centuries, Buddhists had an open canon, where new books and new perspectives could be added to the library of sacred texts, and they would have equal authority to what had been there before. This sense of continuing revelation and deepening understanding was exhilarating to many. It might have been something like the oral Torah of the Jewish Talmud, but the astonishing profusion of Buddhist scripture could also be confusing. Different schools of Buddhism focused on particular texts, and there was a realization that the canon was full of inconsistencies. It was just so large. Nevertheless, the divisions within Buddhism generally did not lead to persecution and violence, as they did so often between Catholics and Protestants in Christianity, or between Sunni and Shia Muslims. In the next few lectures, we'll explore why Buddhism, despite tremendous doctrinal diversity, has generally been a religion of peaceful coexistence. And finally, we can note that Buddhism, like most other religious traditions, encompasses a number of paradoxes and contradictions. These don't discredit or delegitimize the faith. Rather, they function as creative tensions that impel believers toward greater searching and greater dedication. For instance, how can one desire to attain nirvana if desire itself is the problem, according to the Four Noble Truths? How can there be a reincarnation if there's no such thing as a soul? Remember, they're just the five aggregates. There are answers to these questions, but not simple answers. And more to the point in this lecture, why is there such devotion to the scriptures in memorizing and translating and editing and printing them if the scriptures themselves have no ultimate value? In a well-known simile from the Lankavatara Sutra, the scriptures are like a finger pointing at the moon. What's important is not the texts, but the reality that they point toward. At some stage in their spiritual progress, Buddhists leave the scriptures behind. Gaining nirvana has to be an experiential kind of thing. It can't be done through books. And for a religion based on the realization of impermanence, that all things change and eventually disappear, that even Buddhism itself will someday come to an end, which is Buddhist doctrine, what might explain those immense efforts to preserve sacred texts? I'll say it again, the Buddhist canon is huge, yet even so, there's a sense of impermanence and loss that pervades any discussion of it. The scriptures were originally written on dried palm leaves that were quite fragile, particularly in tropical climates of South and Southeast Asia. So typically, these palm leaves will be maybe 2 inches by 10 inches or maybe 20 inches, and then they're bound together with string. And then they needed to be recopied after a certain period, because after a while they start to fall apart, to decay. And most of the Buddhist scriptures written on these palm leaves that we have, the physical artifacts, are mostly from the 18th and 19th centuries. They're copies of copies of copies of copies. The Theravada Pali canon survived in palm leaf manuscripts, but the scriptures of other early schools have not survived. For example, in 1994, the British Library acquired 80 Buddhist manuscript fragments written on birch bark in the ancient Gandhari language of Central Asia and dating to the 1st century of the Common Era. These are the oldest surviving Buddhist writings in the world and were preserved in clay jars in monasteries in Afghanistan. They're not Theravada texts, but instead they seem to be just a tiny fraction of the canon of the Dharma-Guptaka school. It's kind of a poignant reminder of how much has been lost, despite the vast canon that survives. Some Buddhists, concerned about the perishability of palm leaf manuscripts and paper, turned to more durable substances. In caves in Fangshan County, about 40 miles southwest of Beijing, there are more than 14,000 stone slabs inscribed with texts from the Buddhist canon. There are over 22 million characters that have been carved into these stone stelae. This massive project was begun by monks and laypersons in the 7th century, and then eventually it gained governmental support in the 11th and 12th centuries. Similarly, the world's largest book is written not on paper, but on marble tablets, 730 leaves, so that makes 1,460 pages front and back, and each page is 3.5 feet wide and 5 feet high and maybe 5 or 6 inches thick. And each has its own little pagoda. It sits under a little pagoda in a massive array at the Kuthadao Pagoda in Mandalay, Burma. If you stacked up this marble book, all of these pages, it would be more than 300 feet tall. It's a copy of the Pali Canon that was commissioned by King Mindon of Burma in 1860 when he was worried about the cultural effects of the British invasion of southern Burma. He was anxious to preserve this sort of precious Buddhist text that was so important to the Burmese people. Buddhists in East Asia, seeking to preserve and propagate their scriptures, pioneered another tactic as well. They were the first to adopt the new technology of printing. In the year 764, the Japanese Empress Koken commissioned the printing of 1 million copies of a brief Buddhist chant, and each of those copies was housed in a small wooden portable pagoda, about 8 inches tall, and some of those pagodas with the printed chant inside have survived to this day. The world's earliest printed book, produced in 868, is a copy of the Diamond Sutra that was found at Dunhuang, a way station on the ancient Silk Road in northwest China. It had been walled up in a secret vault in a cave temple along with thousands of other manuscripts around the year 1000, and then it was rediscovered in 1900. This copy of the Diamond Sutra is a scroll that's 16 feet long, and it was made from 7 printed sheets of paper that were pasted end to end. So they use a big block printing. They print 7 of different blocks, and then they paste this together. And this scroll, the Diamond Sutra, this particular copy, predated Gutenberg's Bible by almost 600 years. Today it's in the British Library. These printing projects, like the many Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Tibetan editions of the Buddhist canon that followed, were motivated by a desire to preserve the scriptures, to make them more widely available, to show compassion to others, and to gain merit for the next life. Yet in good Buddhist fashion, this merit wasn't always for oneself. The Diamond Sutra from Dunhuang that I just talked about ends with a colophon. So this is an inscription at the very end that reads, "Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Jie on behalf of his 2 parents on the 15th day of the 4th month of the 9th year of the Shentong reign period." So that works out to the 11th of May, the year 868. So in this case, Wang Jie has paid for the printing of this manuscript, which was undoubtedly quite expensive, and he gets merit for that. This is a good action. But rather than keep that for himself, he has dedicated that merit on behalf of his parents who have since passed on to the other side to benefit their souls, or not souls, as Buddhism would have it. The Diamond Sutra is a rather abstruse philosophical text with lots of references to non-being and non-attachment. Yet here we see the importance of Buddhist scripture in dealing with a very particular sort of loss, the death of one's parents. In this way, Buddhists could show the traditional Chinese value of filial piety. Oftentimes, the significance of sacred texts from around the world lies not just in the contents of those books, but also in what they meant to the people who created it and used them for various purposes. One last example comes from a funeral epitaph written in 1619 by a Chinese father for Shun Ajun, the eldest of 2 small daughters he had lost to smallpox within a week. As Ajun's mother chanted scriptures daily in hope of gaining merit for the girl, her father wrote a brief account of her life, which included the following. He says in this written account, "When you were born, I was not pleased. A man over 30 wants a son, not a daughter. But you won me over before you had completed your 1st year. Even then, you would respond with giggles each time I made a face at you. Sometimes you recited the Great Learning while bowing to Amitofo." The Great Learning is one of the Confucian 4 books. We'll hear about that in a later lecture. Continuing with this quotation, "Sometimes you'd play a guessing game with me, and the winner would chase the loser around the house. When you finally caught me, you laughed jubilantly and clapped your hands. Who could have believed that not quite half a month later you would breathe your last? I've been thinking of you all the time. If you know how much I miss you, you'll come back again and again in my dreams. If fate permits, be reborn as my next child. It's actually a very sweet thing that's possible in reincarnation, is the idea that a deceased child might be able to come back as another child. Continuing the quotation, for such hopes, I'm sending you a copy of the Diamond Sutra. Okay, and when he means sending you a copy of the Diamond Sutra, he would take a copy of this scripture and then he'd burn it. And the incense, the smoke of that would go up to the afterworld, sort of like incense. He continues, when you see the king of the underworld, kneel down with raised hands and plead for mercy. Just say the words to him and don't cry and don't be noisy. You must not forget that the underworld is different from your home. Ajahn, your sad father is mourning you. Over the next 4 lectures, we'll be looking at the contents of some of the most famous sacred texts in the Buddhist canon. But to truly appreciate the capacity of these writings to shape and even transform lives, we'll need to keep in mind Ajahn's sad father and how he turned to the Diamond Sutra for help. Hello, it's good to have you back. In a religious tradition with a large canon, some texts are going to get more attention than others. In this lecture, we'll discuss 2 types of Buddhist scriptures that are employed with great frequency, but in very different ways. The first type of text is the Pratimoksha. Those are the rules of the order, and those are in the Vinaya basket. The Pratimoksha is used nearly exclusively by monks and nuns. The second type of text, Jataka, or birth stories, have been beloved by ordinary believers for centuries, and they constitute a subsection within the Sutra basket. But first, a little background about Buddhism. One of the interesting things about Buddhism is that in the early centuries, it was not a religion based on its founder. Siddhartha Gautama, the ancient Indian priest who had become the Buddha, was thought to have discovered and then to have shown others the path to spiritual freedom and non-suffering. But he wasn't the path himself. As a result, the first biographies of the Buddha weren't written until the 1st century of the Common Era, maybe 500 years after his death. You can contrast that with the Christian Gospels that were written maybe 40 to 50 years after Jesus. Bits and pieces of the Buddha's life were recorded in various sacred